Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for a really deep dive into one of the most important pieces of literature ever written, Chinua Achebe's absolute masterpiece, Things Fall Apart. But look, we're not just going to do some dry chapter-by-chapter plot summary today. No way. Instead, we're going to look at this incredible work through the lens of human psychology. We'll examine the complex societal structures it reveals, the devastating impact of cultural collision, and honestly, the timeless themes of identity, fear, and pride that we can actually extract and apply to our own lives. Okay, let's dive into this. What happens when the very thing that makes you successful, the very trait that brings you status and wealth, is exactly what ultimately destroys you? This is a central psychological question that defines our protagonist, Okonkwo. He is a classic tragic hero. And to really understand him, we first have to understand the world he was born into and the brilliant author who brought him to life. Part 1. The Gap in the Bookshelves. Reclaiming the Narrative of Africa. So, before we look at Okonkwo himself, we really need to understand the historical context of this novel, which was published back in 1958. Chinua Achebe grew up receiving an English education, reading classic English literature. But he soon realized that the stories featuring Africans, books like Prester John or Mr. Johnson, were incredibly one-sided. They often portrayed Africans in a negative, really primitive light, basically to rationalize colonialism as the white man's burden. Achebe recognized that his own story, the complex story of his Igbo people, was just completely missing. As he so eloquently put it in a 2008 PBS interview, it was a literal gap in the bookshelf. He wrote Things Fall Apart to fill that gap. And man, fill it he did. The novel has sold over 11 million copies worldwide and has been translated into more than 50 languages. That's just a staggering number. It proves that a highly specific story about a 19th century Nigerian village holds this massive, universal resonance about the human condition. Section 2. The Trap of Rigid Masculinity. The Psychology of Okonkwo. Let's shift our focus to the protagonist at the center of the story, because to truly understand how an entire society can collapse, we've got to look at the inner workings of this one man's mind. And it starts with a stark contrast. We have Okonkwo's father, Unoka. He was gentle, he loved music, but, well, he was also lazy, cowardly, and deeply in debt. Then we have Okonkwo himself, who is wealthy, intensely productive, stoic, and a fierce warrior. Okonkwo's entire identity is basically one massive overcompensation. He is absolutely terrified of resembling his father. Every single action he takes is driven by this profound, almost paralyzing fear of being perceived as weak or soft. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this hypermasculinity completely defines Okonkwo's worldview. Igbo society definitely valued traditional markers of manhood, things like physical prowess, acquiring titles, cultivating yams, but Okonkwo takes these expectations to a really rigid, toxic extreme. He equates manliness strictly with rashness and anger. He regularly beats his wives, he rules his household with an iron fist, and he actively suppresses his own complex, tender emotions, just to maintain this exterior of absolute dominance. This all culminates in the novel's most tragic turning point. Okonkwo actually participates in the ritual killing of his adopted son, Ikemefuna, a boy he inwardly loves. And why? Because, as the text explicitly states, he was afraid of being thought weak. It just proves that his defining emotion isn't actually bravery at all. It's an absolute, deeply rooted fear of vulnerability. Academic research, like this analysis from the International Journal of Creative Research Thoughts, points out that this hypermasculinity is a total double-edged sword. Okonkwo's inability to balance his emotions completely alienates him from his community, and it poisons his family dynamics. His harsh, fear-driven approach to parenting drives away his own son, Nwoye, and literally paves the way for his eventual self-destruction when the world around him begins to change. Section 3. A Complex and Nuanced Society. Busting the Single Narrative. Let's zoom out from Okonkwo's household for a second and look at the wider Igbo society of Umuofia. Remember, Achebe wrote this book specifically to challenge that colonial myth that African tribes were primitive, lawless, or just living in darkness waiting to be saved. Instead, Achebe paints a picture of a fully functioning, highly organized society. They're prosperous, they have sophisticated legal and justice systems for settling disputes, they have vibrant agricultural rituals, and his incredibly deep philosophical foundation, rich in proverbs and music.
Now, Achebe doesn't pretend this society is some flawless utopia. It certainly has its brutal customs and rigid hierarchies, but he establishes it as a complex, independent human civilization standing firmly on its own 2 feet.
Furthermore, while the society is heavily patriarchal, it has a really delicate underlying balance. Academic studies of the text reveal that Igbo culture highly revered female deities, like the earth goddess Ani, and they respected powerful female priestesses, like Cello, who held massive spiritual authority over the men. It's a balance of masculine and feminine energies that Okonkwo tragically entirely ignored to his own detriment. Part 4. When Two Worlds Collide. The Arrival of Colonialism. This brings us to the climax of our explainer. Into this complex, delicately balanced society arrived the British colonialists and Christian missionaries, introducing a radical, totally irreversible disruption to the Igbo way of life. And this brilliantly illustrates Achebe's genius. The oracle refers to the white men as locusts. It's such a powerful metaphor. Just as locusts descend and devour the crops, colonialism is presented as a paradox. Sure, it brings new infrastructure like medicine and education, but it comes at the incredibly steep cost of oppressing the indigenous people and basically eradicating their culture. Interestingly, it's the marginalized people of Umufia, the outcasts and those oppressed by the traditional customs, who are the very first to convert, finding a new sense of belonging that ultimately fractures the clan's unity.
Unable to adapt to this new world and realizing his people are not going to go to war, Okonkwo tragically takes his own life, which is an abomination in his culture. The novel ends from the perspective of the British District Commissioner, who is planning to write a book with this horrific title, The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. It is a chilling final note. It highlights the sheer ignorance of the colonizers, casually reducing the rich, complex culture we just explored into a mere paragraph in some European textbook.
Section 5. Timeless Lessons for Today. Moving from 19th century Nigeria to modern life.
So, how do we bring this incredibly powerful narrative home? Let's transition to the practical wisdom we can extract from this classic text for our own lives today. So, the crucial point is this. Okonkwo's ancient struggles are highly relevant to us right now. First, emotional intelligence. Okonkwo shows us that true strength actually requires embracing vulnerability, not running away from it. Second, adaptability. If you're too rigid as a leader in your workplace or in your politics, the winds of change are going to snap you in half. Third, healthy masculinity. Whether we're talking about parenting or modern relationships, we absolutely have to reject toxic overcompensation and allow for empathy and balance. And finally, nuanced thinking. Achebe is warning us against those simplistic good versus bad narratives, urging us to see the deep complexity in every single culture and every single person. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Take a hard look at your own life. Are there areas where the fear of looking weak is secretly driving your decisions? Are your own rigid beliefs keeping you from adapting to a rapidly changing world? Take a lesson from Okonkwo, embrace the complexity of life, and ensure that your own world doesn't fall apart. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.